As we begin, a painful small business anecdote from the news this week on the COVID-driven demise of small businesses in New York City, where I live. The New York Times reported Monday that nearly 3,000 small businesses have shuttered permanently in New York in the last 4 months, and many of those surviving subsist in relatively parlous conditions. For me, one near heartbreaking detail related to The Strand, a family-owned bookstore that's nearly a century old. It's an institution in New York City. On the plus side, it's very fortunately still open for business, but it has been forced to cut more than 85% of its staff in its first ever layoff in a 93-year history. So very painful to hear. Small businesses, including both newer upstarts and stalwarts like The Strand, have become in many ways a defining feature of the richness and the spirit of our communities, and indeed of the broader idea of entrepreneurial possibility in America. Joining us today to talk about U.S. small businesses is Deepa Mahajan, a partner in McKinsey's San Francisco office who leads our digital payments and fintech work in North America. Deepa is going to help us understand in more detail the threat COVID-19 poses to many U.S. small businesses, and very vitally outline some steps that can be taken by different stakeholders to support small businesses through this crisis. Deepa, thanks so much for joining us, and welcome to McKinsey Live. Over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining this morning or afternoon, depending on where you're based. At the start of 2020, small and medium-sized businesses accounted for over 99% of all businesses in the U.S. They employed nearly 47% of private sector workers and contributed up to 44% of our economic output. Despite being hit hard by the 2008 financial crisis, this sector created nearly 2/3 of net new jobs over the last 20 years. However, the spread of the deadly coronavirus, which as we all know has claimed countless lives and impacted most of ours across the U.S. And world, has placed new pressures and created new challenges on this vital sector of our economy. On the next page, I think it's important to note that small, medium-sized businesses play many roles in our economy. They're not just businesses contributing to the economy, but they actually play the role of being an economic multiplier. They power the larger economy as either suppliers of larger firms or customers of other firms. They're entrepreneurial engines, as I mentioned, contributing a large share of the net new jobs in the last 2 decades. And frankly, almost 20% of small and medium businesses have employees are owned by women. 17% are owned by minorities. They're also community hubs. As Lucia mentioned, we all have a small business or a dozen that frankly play a huge role in our connection to those around us, to our community. And over 9 in 10 Americans purchase items at small businesses at least once a week, meaning it's a core part of just how we access the goods and services that we love. And lastly, prior to the crisis, small businesses employed about half of workers in the private sector, and as I mentioned, accounted for 2/3 of net new jobs. The role they play as employers is a tremendous one, and one particularly salient as we look at the unemployment levels that we're facing today. On the next slide, we've been tracking small and medium business sentiment over time throughout this crisis. Prior to the crisis, about 60% of small businesses were actually quite optimistic about the trajectory of the U.S. economy, making the types of investments that one would make when one is optimistic about the future of the country. However, as soon as the COVID-19 crisis began, we saw an immediate change in the sentiment of small business owners. Optimism has halved since the onset of the crisis, and almost 80% of small business owners are meaningfully concerned or unsure if their business will be sustainable. Additionally, these businesses, even if they were optimistic before the crisis, may not have been financially in a strong situation to be prepared for a downturn. Limited liquidity is a source of risk for small businesses, and in particular, firms helmed by minority business owners were more likely to be classified as at risk or distressed prior to COVID-19. On the next slide, we talk through how COVID-19 is impacting small businesses across our economy. It's a story with many different tales. But if you look across small businesses, some small businesses may close because they're in industries like accommodations, food services, or educational services that are greatly affected by changed customer behavior. This could include the physical distancing we're all doing, our changed demand for more digital goods and services, or operational restrictions that have been mandated by state, local, or federal government. The other reason small businesses may close is that they were already at risk financially before the crisis, lacking cash on hand, or even having a credit score or difficulty in accessing lines of credit they need to invest in the changes required to do business in today's world. Recent research by the Federal Reserve finds that only a third of small businesses were healthy at the end of 2019, and that those that are less healthy are 3 times more likely to close or sell in response to a revenue shock, which is definitely what we have been experiencing over the last few months. On the next slide, as I mentioned, small businesses are more than just businesses, they're employers. And if you actually look at the businesses which are most vulnerable to closure within this crisis, about 1.7 million small businesses are in sectors that are very vulnerable to closure due to COVID-19. They employ 20 million workers, representing about 12% of U.S. revenue. There are another 2 million employer small businesses in sectors that may be less impacted by COVID-19, for example, manufacturing or construction, but that entered the crisis in a position of lower financial resilience, meaning the longer this crisis extends, the more at risk those firms are to closure. So what could this mean for our small business ecosystem? On the next slide, we tried to answer that question. Before accounting for private or public interventions, which are continuously being developed and launched, surveys of small business owners indicated that about a quarter to a third of employer small businesses could close permanently as a result of COVID-19 if they experienced a 4-month revenue shock. Now, this varies, of course, at a local level. Many of us are seeing differences where we're based. I'm in San Francisco. It looks quite different than I think where many of my colleagues in New York or Houston or other cities are. And a lot of this depends on the sectors that we're seeing and the way in which we're handling the crisis at that local level. On the next slide, it's important to note that small businesses are, as I mentioned, also a place where a very diverse landscape, right, accounting for such a significant share of our businesses. The vulnerable sectors we see that are vulnerable to closure create disproportionate risks for populations already underserved. This includes minority business owners, amongst others. Minority-owned businesses are twice as likely to be in sectors that are reporting more effects from COVID-19, so it's 24% versus 13%. In addition to that, you'll notice that the sectors that have the most vulnerability, that's that top right blue quadrant, have the lowest average income for their employees, so those employees already have sort of vulnerability within their own household economic status, and tend to have lower educational attainment, meaning it's really an opportunity for those to access the economy who may not access it in other ways, and access our labor force in other ways.
Deepa,
On the next
question
slide,
here.
Of course.
Sorry to interrupt. Question here. You talked about sectors. How significant a role do barriers to financial inclusion that minority groups tend to face and to have to navigate? Do those, how significant is the role that those barriers play here? That seems like an area that could materially be affected if banks were to be more inclusive, if it is indeed a factor.
It's a really good question. I think the crisis is disproportionately affecting minority-owned small businesses for two different reasons. One is they're more likely to be concentrated in industries that are just more impacted. But second, as you mentioned, they also tend to be disproportionately impacted by underlying issues that make it hard for them to run and scale. And the big one there is limited access to credit. You know, data from a number of different institutions, but in particular, I'll call out one from the Brookings Institute, found that large banks approved about 60% of loans from white small business owners, and just 29% of those by Black small business owners. In addition, research has shown that Black small business owners are significantly more likely to be asked to provide information about their personal financials, like their W-2s, et cetera, when applying for small business loans than others. So particularly in this moment when access to credit is important for all small businesses, I think it's an extra compounding factor for those who are minority-owned business owners.
And can we go back to the previous slide for just a second, the sector-by-sector vulnerability? I think that educational services bar is interesting. Do you think that sort of the persistence of remote schooling or, you know, hybrid on-site and remote models creates an opportunity space for educational services? Is that a way forward? Or, you know, remote tutoring, remote recreational activities? Is there anything there that could be positive?
Yeah, there's maybe two elements I'd share here. One that's really interesting is each of these sectors may mean something different to those of us who spend our time working with large businesses and those of us who may work with small businesses. So in this case, educational services frequently does not mean our public school teachers, for example, who are not small business employees, but would mean, for example, a tutor nearby, or even, you know, other sort of ancillary services that support education. What we are seeing is that there's trends in many different directions here, and I think some negative, as you've mentioned, the shift to digital has been one that's difficult for independent entrepreneurs to necessarily translate all of their in-person materials and techniques to. In addition, as many households have lost one or both sources of income, additional services are the kinds of things where, as your kind of wallet gets thinner, you may need to cut, right? So demand is also impacted. On the other hand, and as we get into this in the presentation, I think you're completely right. There's a lot of opportunity to deliver goods and services in new ways in the crisis. And I think the question of our time will be, how do we help make sure that this is something all businesses can take advantage of, including small and medium-sized businesses, in translating the in-person experience we're used to a digital one, which may enable them to even have a bigger business than before. But it's a big investment.
Thank you.
You know, you were talking, Lucia, about challenges reported. Actually, the next slide goes into that a little bit more and sort of echoes that sentiment. So we've been surveying small business owners on the challenges they're facing as, you know, over time. And these have in some ways stayed the same, but in some ways evolved as the crisis has continued. One that stayed consistent is this number one item, which you'll see about half of small business owners are struggling with. It's the uncertainty of demand. It's not knowing when your customers are going to come, or even if they're going to come. What's really risen to the top of the list here in the last month or so is increased uncertainty due to reopening and closing of the local economy. This has become particularly salient as, you know, I'm sitting in San Francisco. We've actually gone through a full cycle of that. And then third is issues with supply chain. So I think we're seeing increased kind of tensions and fragility within the ecosystems of supply chains we have built as some businesses are closing, as folks are trying to accommodate and adjust to the new patterns of working, which has created challenges, of course, for many small businesses. And then I'll call out one more, which you see sort of mentioned in a number of these different items, which is health and safety of our employees. So challenges with employees not feeling safe coming to work, access to PPE, ensuring that there's childcare options so that employees can have their family remain safe at home while they come into work. So a number of these different elements have just been, I think, core to the experience of adapting to this new environment. On the next page, I think all of these different challenges kind of beg the question of what does this really mean for small businesses? And what we've been hearing both through our surveys, our interviews, and our sort of reading through of other surveys and data sources around small businesses is that there's kind of three main categories of, you could call them problem statements, right, that small business owners are struggling with. First is the crisis is placing pressure on their already slim margins. Many small businesses across sectors came into the crisis with low financial resilience, we talked about earlier. And close to a third were operating at a loss or even breaking even prior to the crisis. The increased cost of compliance with new health codes, a reduction in revenue from the change in demand is definitely adding more complexity to this challenge for business owners. I think second, and Alicia, you kind of raised this when you talked about education, is adapting to new business and operating models. So consumers are changing how they buy. They're changing what they buy. We're seeing a preference for more digital mediums. People are making fewer trips with larger basket sizes. And they're demanding, both because of local regulations, but also consumer demand, more health and safety focused operating procedures. So hand sanitizer offered with meals, et cetera. Small businesses are, I think, really looking to figure out how do we change our business and operating models to address our slimmer margins, to shift to digital, and to find a value proposition that continues to attract customers without having necessarily a fully local presence. And that could include things like focusing on hyper-local trends, competing on quality over price, marketing campaigns to build customer loyalty and further reinforce the idea of small businesses as our community hubs, amongst others. And then the last main challenge, and we sort of talked about this at the start of the discussion, was adopting new technologies. I think many of us sitting at home on these webinars have found that shifting to digital has been something we can do in our work, but it is costly for businesses. It's costly for kind of knowledge workers who, as independent businesses of a few people, need to now invest in technologies they did not have before. But it's also costly for those who sell goods and services to find both the expertise as well as the actual technologies themselves to address the consumer preferences for e-commerce, contactless payments in store, remote work, et cetera. On the next page, I wanted to just bring an example to kind of make this a bit more real. Restaurants, as I think many of us know, face margin challenges, and this was true even before the crisis with fairly slim margins. As you see here, what we did is took basically a sort of simple example P&L of a restaurant to say what would happen due to COVID. A shift to a more off-premise world with delivery and carryout is likely to erode profitability with more packaging costs, more difficulty selling high-margin items like alcohol or desserts, and this places a really strong burden. Nearly 40% of restaurants and small business restaurants were already operating at a loss or break even prior to the crisis. So adding all these additional costs and dealing with the fact that there is actually lower revenue coming in as well takes that slim profit and makes it even slimmer. So it's not all sad. On the next page, I think we're starting to see really, really innovative and interesting examples of both ways that small businesses are dealing with this crisis, but also that at a local level, governments, private sector and public sector have been coming together to truly support our small business community. And at least over the past few months, I think it's made a difference. We're seeing creative solutions around providing support in helping small businesses figure out which financial resources they can access, providing connectivity to technical or business advisors in the community who often are providing that pro bono, and indeed either offering free or at-cost PPE to small business owners to ensure that their employees have access to the safety equipment that they need to do their job. As we, I think, start to enter month 5 of the crisis and look beyond, we'll need to find ways to build on the energy that we've seen at a local level and frankly continue to accelerate our support for the sector. Before we jump into some ideas, let's just get a sense for how long this journey could really be. On the next page, we start to look at how long this crisis could impact various sectors. I'll take a little step back just to give some context. In our last recession in 2008, larger companies took about 4 years to recover to their pre-crisis contribution to GDP. For small businesses, it took about 6. What this means is it often takes longer for small businesses to get back up and recover compared to some of our larger ones. Across, as you'll see here, across industries, the impact of COVID-19 is going to be quite varied. This is a scenario sort of based on the McKinsey partnership with Oxford Economics, and also we picked the scenario based on what sort of leading executives across the world felt like was most likely. So of course, this may change if we end up having a more drawn out public health response or less support from the government, right? And so there's further details on that on our site if anyone's interested. But I'd love to draw just our attention to the fact that some of the most hard-hit industries like arts and entertainment, accommodation and food services could well take 5 or more years to recover to pre-COVID kind of contribution to GDP. On the other hand, some other sectors may only take a few years. That does give us a sense that, you know, we're not in a sprint. This is going to be a marathon. And among small businesses, we will need to do a lot to support their recovery, as it is likely to take even longer than what we're seeing on this chart. And if we don't act, many may never reopen. So let's talk a little bit about what that could look like on the next page. So when we think about recovery for small businesses, I think there's sort of 3 solution spaces for us to contemplate. And I'll offer some suggestions here, but I actually think in some ways this is the call to action for all of us on this call, to start the discussion of how we as community leaders, public and private sector leaders, and small business owners can come together to build the innovative new product, services, and distribution channels we need to support small businesses. One is increasing access to credit and various forms of support, including stimulus money. I think this is critical for 2 reasons. One is every small business owner will need to be making investments to translate their business into our new normal, our now normal, the life we're living in now. In particular, this is going to be extra important for those businesses who already struggle in getting access to credit, which are our more vulnerable populations, including minority-owned small businesses who are, as I mentioned earlier, again, disproportionately hit. The second solution space is going to be helping small businesses rapidly adopt the different types of technologies they need and the different business models they need to operate into this new normal. This includes things like providing continued advisory support, and I actually think even at an industry group level or more regional level, thinking through what are the implications and how a P&L for a business needs to shift and how we help do that so that small business owners can start to make a profit or continue to make a profit through this crisis. And then the third, I think, is a solution space really around not just surviving, but thriving. It's support for small business owners to actually grow their business and recover so that we're not seeing 5 to 7 years of recovery time, which I think most businesses will not last through, but instead a shorter recovery time where small businesses continue to play the core role they play in our economy. This includes things like, frankly, helping small business owners manage their professional and personal balance. It includes things like starting to shift the way we buy our goods, whether that is as individuals or as businesses and governments through our procurement processes, and other things like that. I think we're now coming up on our last page. I just wanted to end with, I think there's a number of different things we can discuss around different ways to solve and help support small businesses. But what I hope all of you took away from this is that this is a crisis, I think, of unprecedented proportions, and I think in many ways an opportunity for the innovation that sits in our DNA as a country to come together to start to come up with innovative products and solutions and support for this tremendously vital part of our lives.
Thanks, Deepa. A couple of questions before we end. We're almost at time. We've had a lot of interesting questions come in through the feed. One, you mentioned you're in California and you've experienced the opening and closing and opening yourself, that kind of stop and start cycle. A question on your page on small restaurants. How does that particular oscillation affect small restaurants in particular, since they would be a category that's subject to reimposition of lockdown measures?
Yeah. You know, what we're hearing from small business owners, I think, is it's really tough. It's tough from a business front because it's hard to figure out how much inventory to keep on hand, how much food to prep, how much planning to do. And you'll see that's why uncertainty was just a huge challenge for small business owners. How do you plan when tomorrow and next week may look fundamentally different than today? And then second, I think it's tremendously devastating for owners and employees, just in terms of managing a sense of how many folks should I have employed? How do I promise my employees that they'll have a stable wage or source of income when I don't know if I need to shut my business in a week? And so I think starting to help folks wrap their head around the uncertainty of this, to give that clarity is really going to be important to make sure we stop economic and psychological damage that can come out of that process.
Interesting. And then to close, do you expect to see a longer term drop in the number of people starting small businesses and sort of the culture of entrepreneurship generally in the U.S.? Do you see that being affected in the medium to longer term as a result of the effects of this crisis?
I think if we were to look at past recessions as some lessons for us to learn, we could look at what happened in 2008. Between 2007 and 2009, the rate at which new firms formed fell by about 20%. And we actually haven't seen the startup rate recover from there since then. My hope would be we find a way to learn from that and make a difference to both the way we support entrepreneurship and the way that we reward entrepreneurship and small businesses in the U.S., but we don't see something similar happen again.
Yep. Deepa, great discussion. We appreciate your time. Thanks to all of us, to all of you in the audience for joining us with McKinsey Live. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. We look forward to your feedback in this super quick survey that's going to appear when you close your event console, 10 seconds max. Please visit our website, mckinsey.com, for more insights into small businesses, as well as for a recording of today's webcast and key takeaways from our discussion with Deepa that'll be posted in the next couple of days. And be sure to register for our next scheduled webinar in mid-August on building more resilient value chains after the COVID-19 crisis. See you there. Have a great day or evening and be well.